I have absolutely been meaning to cover this since forever. Um, so this is generally in line with the Malthusian theme that I have. Um, all right. So, the Malthusian delusion and the origins of population control. And so, this is a quote from William Hazlitt on a reply to the essay on population by the Reverend T.R. Malthus. It is astonishing what a propensity Mr. Malthus has to try experiments. If there is any mischief to be done by them, he has a perfect horror of experiments that are to be tried on the higher qualities of our nature, from which any great unmixed and general good to be expected, but in proportion as the end is low and the means base, he acquires confidence, his tremors forsake him, and he approaches boldly to the task with uh, nerves of iron, I'm assuming. Alright. The first population bomber of the modern age was by profession at least, ill suited to the task. The Reverend Thomas Malthus, Anglican clergyman, predicted in 1998 that there would be standing room only on this earth by the year of our Lord 1890. A London talk by Benjamin Franklin inflamed Malthus' imagination. The American polymath had proudly proclaimed to his English audience that the population of their former colonies was growing at a rate of 3% a year. The, the good parson, who fancied himself something of a mathematician, knew that this meant the America's population was doubling every 23 years or so. He pondered this remorseless geometric progression during the long walks he was accustomed to take in the English countryside, becoming increasingly concerned about the staggering numbers 2, 3, 8, 16, 32, 64 that would soon result. He imagined the boroughs filling up with people until every available nook and cranny was choked with human misery. How could this coming horde of humanity possibly be fed? He wondered. How could sufficient grain be grown in the green fields he was passing, even if every moor, hedgerow, and woodland was brought under cultivation? An arithmetic increase in the food supply, 2, 4, 6, 8, was the best that could be hoped for. But with men multiplying geometrically and food only arithmetically, the number of people would inevitably outstrip the food supply. It was perhaps the very simplicity of the parson's notion that gave it such a strong grip of his mind. Better minds than his would soon fall prey to the same Malthusian delusion. The first population bomb. Malthus published his speculations in 1798 in a tract called An Essay on the Principle of Population. Despite its scholarly-sounding title, this was the original population bomb. It contained no images of exploded ordnances. These would be reserved for our less genteel age, but like its latter-day imitators, it aroused great public concern by painting a picture of imminent catastrophe brought on by the unchecked growth in human numbers. Such a fate, Malthus argued, could only be avoided by stern, even pitiless measures. The problem, as he saw it, was that the death rate in England was in marked decline. Before the advent of modern means of sanitation and medicine, roughly 40 out of every 1,000 people had died each year, but as the Industrial Revolution spread, it brought better housing and nutrition for the poor, and provided the means for public authorities to underwrite public health and sanitation measures. The death rate had dropped to 30,000 and was still falling. Malthus proposed to undo this. All children born beyond what could quote, all children born beyond what would be required to keep up the population to a desired level must necessarily perish unless room be made for them by the deaths of grown persons. Therefore, we should facilitate instead of foolishly and vainly endeavoring to impede the operations of nature in producing this mortality. And if we dread to frequently frequent visitations of the horrid form of famine, we should sed- sedulously encourage the other forms of destruction, which we compel nature to use. Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. In the country, we should build our villages near stagnant pools and particularly encourage settlements in marshy and unwholesome situations. But above all, we should reprobate, i.e., reject specific remedies for ravaging diseases, and restrain these benevolent but much mistaken men who have thought they were doing a service to mankind by projecting schemes for the total extirpation for particular disorders. I think we kind of do this. Like, people are in their situations of drug abuse and homeless, and they get stuck in bad habits, and that becomes a part of their destiny and how we view them as a demographic of homelessness. Um, and this is kind of how we had house reverberation acts when immigration was coming in I would have to get back to that, but in 1800 there were acts to fix up apartments because there was the air quality was bad. So, but before then, it was easier to judge the location with the people and say that they're at fault for the slums they live in. Of course, there will always be the essentialization and sort of manipulation of the middle class to that. Just be aware of that. All right, strange views. These were strange, almost diabolical views. Oh, by the way, as I was saying before, it is easier almost to get drugs in certain circumstances than food these days being so expensive comparably. Sorry about that. All right. These were strange, almost diabolical views for a member of the Christian clergy to hold. Did Malthus really mourn over baptism while celebrating funeral rites with a particular zest? His population control measures were denounced by his many fellow Christians who rejected them as an offense against charity, much less common sense. They were embraced, however, by members of the British upper class, an increasingly barren lot themselves. They feared the poor were becoming too prolific, not to mention too powerful in the polls and in the marketplace. These Malthusians, as they came to be called, helped to ensure that their founder's essay on population was a commercial success, appearing in no fewer than 6 editions from 1798 to 1826. Population horror stories have sold well ever since. So originally there was the meek shall inherit the earth, which I assume was the downtrodden, but uh, I think this might play into at least modern day wise the fear of communism and how basically like the you know people escaping their initial homelands and coming from war-torn or environmentally distressed areas. Uh, I believe that could be the meek in the modern day. Getting a little ahead of myself here. Okay. Lifespans lengthened, the general health improved throughout the 19th century, but Charles Darwin gave the Malthusians something new to brood over. Not only were the poor too prolific, but By having all these children, most of whom, to make matters worse, now survived childhood, they were rapidly doubling or dumping down the population. Or, okay, I think I've heard this before. Uh, the Flynn effect or something. For the prosperous and privileged who found themselves increasingly outnumbered by the great unwashed, this was the survival of the fittest in reverse. This view was given intellectual respectability by Francis Galton, a cousin of Darwin himself. In his inquiries in human faculty and its development, Galton gave a pseudoscientific gloss to what he saw as the declining genetic stock of the nation. To encounter this dysgenic trend, he proposed an active policy of, quote, eugenics, a word he coined meaning good births. Eugenics would encourage more children from the fit and fewer, or no children from the unfit, with the ultimate goal of engineering the evolutionary ascent of man. Alright, so I'm not going to get into it now, but there's a big difference, in my opinion, between eugenics, genocide, and population control as a generality. It's just the magnitudes and the the mechanisms of involvement are so different. Such views were eagerly embraced by the secular humanists of the early 20th century who, as in our day, were busy thinking of ways to improve the natural man at the same time that they reduced his numbers. Malthus, in particular, improved a fit uh, precursor to Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger, who also opposed helping the poor. Humanitarianism and philanthropy. She wrote following the good Reverend merely, quote, perpetuate constant increasing numbers of defectives, delinquents, and dependents. These dangers are inherent in the very idea of humanitarianism and altruism, dangers which have today produced their full harvest of human waste. So, there's a lot of things that people claim are Margaret Sanger that actually are not. So, this might actually not be Margaret Sanger's quote. Um, there's some actual pretty racist quote from Webb Du Bois, who worked with the Negro Project. So, that's pretty edgy. Alright, where was I? But while Malthus was content to wait for a plague, pestilence, and putrefaction to check human numbers, he opposed contraception and abortion. Sanger, not one for half measures, wanted to stop the unfit from conceiving children in the first place. She unabashedly called for the elimination of human weeds, for the secession of charity, for the forced segregation of morons, misfits, and the maladjusted, and for the sterilization of genetically inferior races. American Birth Control League. Setting up the American Birth Control League, the precursor to Planned Parenthood, Sanger sought to put her beliefs into action. To ensure less children from the unfit, she opened birth control clinics targeting ill-favored and dysgenic races such as blacks, Hispanics, and Amerins, fundamentalists, and Catholics. Sensing a kindred spirit, Southern public health officials wrote and asked her what could be done in their states. Her response was the infamous Negro Project, in which she asserted that the mass of Negroes, particularly in the South, still Okay, yes, this is Du Bois' quote, actually, in that the increase among the black community is from the portion of the population least intelligent and fit. In order to remedy this eugenic horror story, the project aimed to hire colored ministers, preferably with social service backgrounds and with engaging personalities, to travel south through the South, preaching the virtues of population control. The fit, on the other hand, would be strongly encouraged to have children. Sanger's goal, in her own words, was to create a race of thoroughbreds. Although she failed in this venture, as Hitler would fail even more spectacularly after, she did manage to round up quite a stable of wealthy supporters. Um, so Rockefeller was a part of the Planned Parenthood, but in another book I was reading, she was actually very against Rockefeller and the rich in a part of her life. And only after her death, I believe, did the Rockefellers start to utilize the Planned Parent, yeah. These had names like Rockefeller, Duke, Scaife, Lasker, Sulzberger, and DuPont, and were easy marks for Sanger's arguments because they had always thought themselves the product of superior bloodlines. In reality, most of Sanger's thoroughbreds had no great natural gifts, for the for the accident of an inherited wealth would have merely middle class prospects. The Population Council. The Nazis took active measures to purify the bloodlines and improve the stock of the superior Aryan race went well beyond anything envisioned by Sanger, and even in her darkest moments. The entire well, she did collude with the KKK, so I think that was probably the edgiest thing she did. Okay, the entire eugenics project went into eclipse, its advocates headedly denying that they had any ever meant any such thing as Dachau, Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen. For all that, population quality remained a concern for the population community, control community, and carefully disguised over time would creep back into their discourse. When John D. Rockefeller III drew up the draft charter of the Population Council in 1954, for example, he included a paragraph calling for the promotion of research so that, quote, within every social and economic grouping, parents who are above the average in intelligence, quality of personality, and affection would tend to have larger than average families. Thomas Perrin, a former Surgeon General and one of the few Catholics in Rockefeller's circle, objected that, frankly, the implications of this, while I know are intended to have a eugenic implication, could readily be misunderstood as Nazi master race philosophy. The paragraph was quietly dropped. Well, at least that person had common sense, but this only pushed it under the ground further. Maybe if they had said something to sabotage it, or had said nothing to sabotage it, knowing that this would have implications towards the rhetoric, you know, I don't know. This person probably wanted it to go underground as a Catholic. Even then, that's pretty sad. But while Rockefeller and others could easily be shamed into silence on the need to remedy humanity, the horror of the Holocaust did not prevent them from talking publicly about the continuing need to reduce human numbers. After World War II, the US and other developed countries had sent many medical and aid workers overseas, and these benevolent but most mistaken men, as Malthus had scornfully called them, were successfully eliminating many of the infectious diseases which had long plagued the developing world. While birth rates remained high, the mortality rates were falling. The populations of Latin America, Africa, and Asia were beginning a period of rapid growth. With the help of Rockefeller and other men of great wealth, controlling this growth was soon to be on the national agenda. Controlling the population. Growth seems to arouse a primal fear in the wealthy, who somehow feel threatened by the poor and their numbers. How else to explain the epiphany experienced by John D. Rockefeller III, grandson of oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller and one of the wealthiest men in the world, when he encountered the impoverished masses of the developing world? A dilettante who had never held a steady job, he made extended journeys to Asia and Africa after the war. Okay, by the way, a dilettante is somebody who has like interests in stuff but doesn't really put much effort into it. Okay, he came away convinced that Western efforts to check what he saw as runaway population growth must take precedence over economic development. He had found that the cause. Oh, sorry. He had found the cause that would consume his life. His efforts to win over his fellow Rockefeller Foundation trustees in his new passion failed, however. The majority believed correctly, as history would show, that Western technology, particularly American agricultural know-how, would enable the people of the world to continue feeding themselves. They rejected his controversial proposal to develop new birth control methods and export these to the developing world. Denied access to the family fortune, Rockefeller used his own money, a sure sign of the true believer, to set up the Population Council in 1952. The council posed as a neutral scientific organization. It still does, but its purpose in Rockefeller's mind was clear: to control global population growth, although his brother Nelson worried about the negative impact that these fringe activities might have on his own political career. The family as a whole supported the Rockefellers' scion efforts, although whether this was from a shared conviction or simply to help him find himself is not clear. The family attorney opined that, quote, "My own feeling is that he, Rockefeller III, has the time to do it, and that one of the things that he most needs is some activity which will occupy his full time 5 days a week. It seems to me that if he works at this conscientiously for years or two, he might make a consequential dent in the population." In fact, he was to work as the president, later as the chairman of the Population Council for the next quarter century, and as for the dent in the humanity, it was considerable. Okay, so the way that this dude is being framed as is just like he's bored and has the money to just do what he wants, and controlling bodies or as a form of biopolitics into necropolitics. That's pretty dark. All right. I will get to this in the next one, guys. Gotta answer some text.